Hello, and welcome to Property Matters, a weekly look at all matters property designed to be of interest to anyone who has an interest in property. Property Matters is supported by Fairview International Property Consultancy and auctionproperty.co.uk. We're looking at those big stories of the week each and every Sunday so that you can join in the conversation with us as well. So please do so wherever you're watching us today in the chat section below the programme. And of course, don't forget to like our page and subscribe for all the notifications, and the email address if you want to get in touch, propertymatterstv@gmail.com. Joining us as always, property expert Joe Joshi. Morning, Joe.
Morning, Paul. Morning, everybody. Welcome to our Property Matters. We try and bring all the regular news to you as Paul has said earlier on, week in, week out. And of course, it's always made more interesting when you all interact with us. I look forward to having your questions whenever you get a chance to raise them.
And we're going to do a little bit of stargazing, gazing into the future today, Joe, because the first story looks at the 5-year forecast on residential sales and rentals. This is something that Knight Frank do on a regular basis. And it's pretty interesting to see how the market's going to look over the next 5 years, because we've got some very interesting conditions at play with inflation and so on, and the fact that the property market itself seems to be just ignoring all the challenges that people are facing with the cost of living, and the prices seem to keep rising. And the first thing they mention is the fact that the property market seems to have defied gravity, as they put it, over the course of the pandemic, and that's been caused by the tight supply and those low interest rates, of course. And the fact that during lockdown, of course, there was a lot of accumulated wealth acquired by people. And of course, they've then felt emboldened to go out and purchase. And they believe that now the headwinds are coming, and of course, that's going to slow things down somewhat. So they think that the prices, Joe, are going to be growing by 5% this year. And that's going to have a drag, obviously, what with the cost of mortgages going up and so on. But the mortgage rates will continue to rise as well, and the fact that the costs from the Ukraine conflict are having an impact on people. But basically, over the next 5 years, they're saying that generally to 2026, that the property market will grow by 13.6%, which is quite an interesting figure. What do you make of that over the next 5 years? Your property growing by 13.6%.
Well, it's interesting that someone has Mystic Meg's crystal ball in front of them and forecasts such a situation in the future. I think when you look at analysis, always, Paul, that there's always going to be a view, and it's always about a view of someone that sees certain growths. In my mind, I think they've got some of that right, in the sense that, yes, 13% in 5 years, when you compare it to the last 2 years, is probably a fraction. But at the same time, when you say to yourself, I've got a property that I've invested in and it's growing, it's better than it going shrinking. And which is the case with a lot of things that we tend to do as investors, especially when you take the risks in the stock market, and you take that situation with both hands and hope and pray that it's going to go in the right direction. Whereas at least one thing for sure with bricks and mortar is that whilst there might be a slow in the market, or there might be a slight downturn or a correction, as I would say, there's always going to be the certainty that at some stage or another it's going to go forward. As I tend to use the the gear stick as our direction of route. It stays in neutral for a while until it gathers pace, and then of course we go back into drive. But very rarely have we gone into the reverse. In fact, over the last 40 odd years, I don't see it has gone into reverse. It's gone into neutral more than reverse ever. So 5% over the balance of this year. It's not fantastic, but at the same time, when you say to yourself, it's a plus, it's a 5% plus, and considering all the things that are going on, including the situation in Ukraine, inflation rising, obviously all the utility bills have been rising, interest rates are rising, and interest rates, whilst they're rising, are still quite relatively low. for
Mm.
the time being. And if you go to your lenders, they're offering you pretty good fixed rates in order to stay. So if you actually uh, joined the crystal ball analogy here and fixed it for the next 5 years with your bank of your mortgage, then really you can't be much safer than that. And say to yourself, at least I know that my mortgage rate is going to be fixed at that level for the next 5 years. And in 5 years' time, if the increase is showing around 13%, it all depends on what happens in the next 5 years. I mean, it's hard to actually predict what can happen tomorrow, let alone what can happen in the next 5 years. Because when you think the last 2 stroke 3 years, we never anticipated what happened in the last 2 to 3 years, not just in our own social and personal world, but also in the property world. It was just not there. But what really comes to light here, at the end of the day, is something that Property Matters myself have always harped on about, and that is that there is nothing better and safer than bricks and mortar. Even in a bad time, it looks better than the worst of something else. 5% increase is far greater and far better than a potential investment in a stock market where things are volatile. So, for example, Netflix, recently reduced their thing, and instantly they lost quite a bit on the stock market. So if you invested in that, thinking everybody's going to watch films forever and a day, and all of a sudden next morning the statistics show that you've just lost millions or billions of pounds of the bottom line. That is unpredictable. But what is predictable to a large extent is that there is some safety in the numbers of buying property.
Yes, it's a an investment that's certainly a secure and safe one for sure, isn't it? I mean, it's interesting in that 13.6%. This year is predicted to be 5, but you think, well, hang on, that's over the 5 years is 13.6. That suggests that if 5% of that 13% is in this first year, then it's going to be pretty slow. And in fact, they're predicting that house prices will grow in 2023 when they really think that the inflation will be biting everyone. They think that the prices will go by just 1%, which is an interesting statistic. They also suggest that the race for space is far from over, Joe, because for a lot of people, this kind of hybrid working is still very much not set in stone. It's working for the moment, but it could easily be that the company turns around and says, right, we've decided now, actually, we did say you could do 2 days at work and 2 days in the office and 3 at home, or vice versa, or whatever. Now we want you all back in all the time, or actually, do you know what? We're going to close the office and we want you all working from home permanently. So they still think there's a lot of, and there's still a lot of people holding on to the money they accumulated through lockdown. Um, for this very reason, that they may finally find out sometime down the road what life's going to look like for them all as a family. And that's an interesting thought, isn't it?
I think it's great that those people that had the benefit of having the chance to save some money can actually hold on to that. That's excellent news. Some of them spent it perhaps wisely in some cases and not so wisely in others. But certainly those that decided to move for the race for space, got some good deals and have moved. Having had conversations more recently with a variety of people that are working hybrid from home and office and all going back to the office or are stuck at home, it's quite an interesting mixed bag reaction. Um, for those that it creates a convenience, um, it then is excellent, the hybrid or working from home, especially those that have children or are partners with a child in tow. It allows them to sort of now save more and work well at home in terms of the flexibility they have for childcare, for argument's sake, because childcare is a huge battle for most parents, especially if both parents are working. They could actually be ended up spending quite a lot of money out of their income and time, travel, and so forth in simply funding childcare situations. And that may not be a brilliant thought for the childcare business because all of a sudden people are going to say, well, actually, I don't need to pay £700 or £1,000 a month that is going out. That's significantly good money. That's nearly 12, if you average at £1,000 a month, it's £12,000 a year. That I don't actually need to do. Also, I don't have to do too much traveling, and so I'm saving on my travel as well. And actually, I'm giving a good life to my child because we are here hands-on as parents, rather than it being brought up through a nursery or a day nursery of some sort. So it has its pluses for those particular people, but of course, those that are perhaps single are desperate to go back to the office because working from home is a pretty lonely business, and it's fun for the short term, but when you actually realise that you are kind of zoomed out, excuse the pun there, but that's kind of what we've lived off. You actually almost want to be in the zone. You want to be amongst people. You want to interact, and you want to be able to go to the wine bar and have a glass of wine or a beer or whatever and chat and chew the cud and mull over the things that you want to do. But those are the things that are not available. It also it causes a huge mental health issue for those people that are just stuck at home. So they are quite keen to get back into offices. So I've had a mixed conversation with people because having sort of met people from all those sort of walks of life through their homes and their properties, we get to understand what makes them feel real. And what makes people feel real is, to go to work. And of course, companies, those that have chosen to not operate their offices from central London, can and have perhaps moved to cheaper and better locations. So it's been a complete mixed bag of what is actually happening. But in there, the steadiness has been that, property has been the focal point in pretty much everything because it allows people to work from home, have the facility for their children, allows people to go to work, and the market in London, is beginning to shape up again. And of course, it still allows people to go further afield and have that race for space underlined where they can get better value for money. So um, very interesting all around in the property world, and that's what makes our program more and more interesting each time because there is such a variety going on in the marketplace, but equally there's a lot of variety going on in people's minds and the way they're thinking and what is the future.
You mentioned regional differences there, Joe, a moment ago, and that's the next point that they bring up is that, for example, the Midlands, they believe, is going to do particularly well in the next 5 years. Anyone thinking of investing should look at the Midlands perhaps as an opportunity, because not least the fact, of course, because the massive explosion in logistics. Whilst we were all sat at home for 2 years, we had a logistics industry growing exponentially, and of course, as you've mentioned before on this show, when you go up the M1. Either side now, you see huge warehouses, all with Amazon written on the side of them, and they think that the Midlands will benefit from the logistics sector and also indeed life sciences. And if we look at London specifically, Joe, it's an interesting situation, they think, with prime central London. Whilst they're saying that nationally prices will grow by 5% this year, they're suggesting it's only going to be 3.5% in London this year in Zone 1, for example. But then in 2023, they reckon that's when the international buyers are going to come back. And they reckon growth, which we said for the country would be 1% next year, is going to be in London 6%. And overall, over the 5 years, here's the figure, 22.2% in Zone 1 prime central London. So compared to 15.6% for the whole country over the next 5 years, seems like central London's the place to be if you can afford to invest.
Yeah, and both of those hubs are equally important to different people. Midlands are a great opportunity for people that are moving out of London, perhaps, and are going to be living on the outskirts and around the Midlands for accessibility. Also, the scope for the high-speed network rail that will eventually transpire over the next 5 to 10 years. It will start to come together. All of those things will make the Midlands a really, really important investment area. And of course, quality of life. It's nice to be able to travel further out and see. I know recently I was in the beautiful part of Derbyshire, and you just don't realise what England is all about until you go to places like Derbyshire and perhaps the Lake Districts and so forth. That how lovely it is to visit those places, and why people want to live there because of the way the whole infrastructure is and how green it is and all the natural stuff. So there's that sort of wish and want of people that say, well, I don't want to be in the city anymore, but I want to go out and live in the countryside and enjoy all the activities that are available within the countryside. On the other hand, our international players will come to London. London is the center of the universe for what it's worth for those that want to have a number of things. Security is probably paramount for everyone all over the world. London is one of the most secure and safest places that you could probably come to. And no matter what atrocities happen all over the world, they all escape, and they have their haven in London for, as I said, security, safety, education, systems, legality. All of those things are very clear and upfront. People know what they're getting. It says it on the tin, and you buy it. Whereas that uncertainty in many parts of the world is what makes it scarce for those, even though the bigger cities like Paris, New York, and so forth have their own reasons. London has a very clear reason, and of course, one of those is language. And you have to understand that the second language, pretty much in every country across the world, is English. And everybody, at some stage or another, can put a couple of sentences together, in English, even if it means that you want to go and get a newspaper at the local shop. Everybody knows how to find a local shop with a newspaper in it, sort of argument's sake. But you try and do that in France, or you try and do that in Germany, or some of the other places, and the people there don't even want to communicate with you in that language. So that the language is a huge draw. And if you look at the countries that those languages are draws to for international players, are New York, London, places like Canada, places like Australia, and of course New Zealand. All of the British English-speaking countries that people feel comfortable in going to as their first port of call, because even in Africa, the second language they teach is English. So it doesn't matter what part of the world you're in. So those are the reasons why London is always a magnet for people to come to, but also that's what stirs up the values in properties.
Talking about the outer London area for a second, that's going to be pretty much in line with the country, 15.9%. And they reckon that any of the prime sort of city markets out in the country, so that the bigger cities, the regional cities, are going to be about 17% over the next 5 years, which is all reasonable as we've outlined. Looking at the rental market, they're suggesting that rents are going to increase by 4% this year, building on a really strong performance at the back end of last year. Longer term, some supply constraints, strong tenant demand, and obviously tenants earning more money because inflation will fuel wages. They suggest that there's going to be an increase of 17.1% in rental values over the next 5 years. So if rental's going to go up by 17% and the property's going to go up by around 15, 16%, it would suggest that if people are looking to get into renting a property out, buying a property to let, in other words, that they should get in sooner rather than later.
That is always the case, isn't it? And then you look back at some of the statistics that we've been covering through our programs, the ups and downs and the yo-yo that has been offered in terms of, how many people are going to run away from rental properties. It's not true. How many people are going to dump properties because they think it's just too expensive taxation-wise? Not true. and I've as an individual, and every question you've raised, I have continuously said, and will continue to say, that there is nothing safer than the bricks and mortars of it. That's what I've done for 42 years of my life. And I can go back for the last God knows how many years, and everyone, if I had a penny or a pound for everyone who says to me, house prices will drop, people are going to dump rental properties, nobody wants to do buy to let. It's all a load of rubbish, because at the end of the day, everyone feels much happier and safer in those. And of course, it's a supply and demand game, and the rental market is now on a huge demand. People are coming back. They go, students, every city has a university. All of those areas are known to be occupied by students. So they need accommodation. Education is a prime thing. And people want to go back to work. So they need accommodation. So they're going to rent. And of course, if there's a lesser demand or a lesser supply, should I say, and the demand's high, it's natural that rent's going to. And the quality, this is where landlords must take heed. Quality of what you produce and present for rental is what's going to demand your best rent. If you're going to give out rubbish, you're going to get rubbish. It's as simple as that, you know. So if you're going to invest in your property and get it right and get it done properly, then of course people will be delighted to pay you a good rent, because at the end of the day, they want a nice home to live in.
The suggestion is that certainly rental yields will be stronger in the north because they feel there's still, obviously, people have been buying enthusiastically there because the value's been so strong. And therefore, I suppose as a result of that, the rental prices will come up. But they're saying the reason that rents will remain so strong is that, for example, in January of this year, the number of properties available to rent in the first quarter of this year was more than a third lower than the 5-year average pre-pandemic. And yet the number of people looking to rent property is at its highest level for a while too. So there's lots of demand, and for whatever reason, whether it is landlords getting out of the industry because they don't believe the money's in there anymore, or for whatever reason, there aren't as many instructions coming in for rental properties through agents, letting agents and so on. So they can see more and more people wanting to rent, less and less properties available to rent, and that's creating a similar situation to the short supply in the sales market.
It's a combination, isn't it? If you think about it, that, you know, when the market says and the taxation goes up and people say, well, actually, I'm going to get out because that. So the media will look at it as an excuse to say people are now getting out of the rental market. The truth of that is that some of those properties that they're selling are properties that probably are tired. And the question is always about, you know, whether it's worth investing more money into that or coming out of that and perhaps renewing the quality of the stock that you're going to be renting out. So sometimes, you know, people buy blocks now or have bought office conversions where they've actually ended up owning a whole block and converting, and therefore they've actually invested wisely. There's a whole bunch of other things that underline their reasons to why they sell. Though the media would obviously say, oh, well, because the high rises in the taxes and so forth, people want to sell. But I've seen sometimes that people, it makes more sense for someone to actually sell something that is now needs maybe 15, 20, 30,000 pounds, you know, refurbishment. Also the ones that have got shorter leases, those are better off sold. The problem is that you've already milked that cow pretty well for the last 15, 20, 30 years, whatever you've had it. Now the lease is now down to less than 60 years old. The landlord is looking for a chunk of that. So that money you made over that last 15, 20, 30 years, you're just about to feed that to the landlord to increase the lease. But that may be the right and opportune moment to say, you know what, it's time for me to get out. I've had the best of this. Let someone else have it. And the new person comes in and says, actually, I don't mind paying £30,000 to renew the lease because I'm going to be in this for the next 15, 20, 30 years. So it's a good investment for them going forward, but maybe not such a good investment for the guys coming out of it. But of course, that is how, you know, the cycle works. They come out of it and perhaps buy something newer. And long may those things continue, because long may my career continue on those bases.
Our second story kind of follows on quite nicely from that, because this is the first year since 2016 where investors bought more properties than they sold. This is coming from a new report from Hamptons. So the appetite to invest in property is on the rise again as the share of homes bought by landlords across Great Britain rose from 12% to 13.9% from 21 to 22 in that first quarter. So basically, it looks like, and this was the time actually, 2016, when people were investing to beat the 3% stamp duty surcharge, if you remember, on second homes. So that kind of fueled the market back in 2016. So this is quite something really to see it rise at this point. And the suggestion is, of course, that People are looking at their investments and they're looking at inflation and they're thinking, well, there's just no way that these investments are going to keep up. So, of course, this is suggesting that, well, what do I do with my money? Which is something that you've mentioned many times on this show. I better get myself a buy-to-let property so that I can protect my investment and keep my capital growing. And I guess that's what many people are going to be doing in the absence of anything else.
There isn't another source, as we have already tried to do that on Property Matters a number of times. And the only thing that I could have brought to live and obviously introduced was someone like Agam Jan from Vector Capital, because I felt that that was something that had a good alternative. I'm not saying that we are here as financial advisors or are governed by any particular body. It's purely a general view of what actually gives the cover and the strength in the property market. And so there are people out there that will say to themselves, well, look what's happened in the property market for the last so many years. Look what Knight Frank's crystal ball is saying and what London's going to do. Where is it safer for me to be investing? Of course, I may as well carry on investing in a buy-to-let type of property, no matter where in the country is. It's all about stepping into the property. And I say that to first-time buyers. Even if you got to go and buy further out and come back later on, if you're not in it, you're not going to win it. You've got to be in the game. You've got to have your foot on the run of the ladder. You've got to be starting somewhere. And if it means that you've got to go and buy something, north, and you rent it out for the next year, 2 years, 3 years, or whatever you decide to do, it's going to grow. And if it grows, you're going to have a better saving result than you are perhaps if you actually open a savings account or an ISA and hope to put a certain amount in there every month, because you know that that's not going to happen. And if it does happen, that rainy day comes along, you're going to go, I'll draw that, £4,000 or £5,000 I saved on, because maybe I've got to go and buy a new car all of a sudden, or something else happens in your life, and boom, that's right. But the good thing about it being in property is that you can't always go back very quickly and say, look, let me take that 5-10 grand out, it's gone up out. Actually, you're inclined probably not to. You'll find another way, but you'd rather leave that there and say, well, actually, if it's done well this year, it's probably going to do even better the year after, and I'm going to have £20,000 equity in my property as opposed to not having zero. So you've got to be in it to win it, and that's what here the investors are saying. They've still got to find somewhere where they're going to put their money, their savings, etc. And of course, the rental market will continue to do that.
It's interesting to look at some of these the figures. So, for example, in the first quarter of 2021, we had a net loss of rental homes available of just over 7,500. And this year, same quarter, 2022, a net gain of nearly 13,500 new properties. So that's more property coming onto the market available for rent. And that's a decline that's been going on since 2017. So this is the first time in that quarter that we've had this but bounce back, I suppose, is the word you'd use, isn't it? Of 13,500 net gain of rental properties, which has got to be great news for tenants looking to move into a right property. But as you say, that's going to increase the competition for the better quality properties, isn't it?
And that's the key. Here is the message of the better quality properties. And so when they come available, and that may come available in new blocks or newly refurbished properties, there's going to be a certain number of refurbishments that are going to have to be, sort of left and not occupied. So yeah, it's a cycle, and it will continue, and it has done so for many years. And I can't, endorse a better way for you to sort of, as our viewers, listeners, to be able to sort of say, well, actually, you know what, these guys come up every Sunday morning and he goes on about the same thing, and hopefully some Sundays down the road you'll look back and go, it was a good advice, good guidance, and that's really our purpose. And I think there is a huge increase, but that's an increase combined of people. And if you look back the last couple of years, Paul, you will see that number of people that have actually had time on their hand, because we couldn't go to the pub, couldn't go to the restaurant, couldn't go and even see your family or do anything. So what did you do? You refurbished your properties. You went down, because the only market that did very well was the DIY market and the housing market, and because people spent their time, so they had properties that may be vacant. the whole circumstances of the pandemic was such that people couldn't move into new places, and people couldn't leave their existing places because it was an impossible task. People couldn't view, people couldn't do anything. It was a very, unusual circumstance that happened over the last 2 years. But those that capitalized out and made the best out of it, used that time wisely, used that money that they saved wisely, and invested it into property, which they refurbished. And today you've probably seen the result of some of those coming back to the market, ready to be rented, just as the market begins to turn positively.
Some interesting figures here. 71% of investors bought in the 50% highest yielding areas of the country. So nearly 3/4 of investors were buying in the places where the yield is going to be at its highest. It's one of the reasons why nearly 3/4 of London-based landlords bought their buy-to-lets outside of the capital, even though they're London-based, where the yields tended to be higher. So that's up from 1/4 from a decade ago. So Northeast is the capital, is the buy-to-let capital of Britain. They say investors purchased nearly 28% of homes there in the first 3 months of this year, and that's more than twice that were bought by first-time buyers. And yields are averaging around 9%, and Middlesbrough is the capital of the buy-to-let area of the northeast, and rents there yielding at 9%. So that's the place. If you can get up there and find the right properties, that's the place to go and get the biggest yield if you want to hedge against inflation.
Absolutely, and again, it goes back to our point that people are prepared and better value for money. I mean, £1 million in London will probably buy you 10 properties in the north.
Mm.
It doesn't take Einstein to work out that all of a sudden you've got a better reserve and a better return on your investment overall, and hence why London landlords have been buying in droves in other areas, because they know. So, and also if they have a bulk interest in there, it makes their life a lot easier than having one. To travel to Middlesbrough to look at one rented property actually probably will cost you the whole tank of fuel that it's going to cost you to get up there. But if you have 10, then it's worth actually spending that tank of fuel and saying, okay, well, whilst I'm here, I'll look at my portfolio of the 10 properties or 5 properties, and that makes it viable. So, they have been buying in droves in the north.
Indeed. And talking of buying property, we've got a property of the week for you to tell us about. This is flat 1 and 2, 23 Malvern Road in northwest London, Joe.
So here's an example of what we've been talking about, really. Northwest London, again, very commutable. Zone 2 kind of it falls into as far as the underground is concerned. We're selling a property here that's yielding about £60,000 a year rent. So almost sort of somewhere between 6.5-7% return, which for London is very, very good. And it's rented out on a sort of nightly base, so there's regular income coming from there. And so it's in our auction. It's currently basically 2 flats, but even though it's the 2 flats, they are rented out on a room by room basis. On a nightly base, on an HMO, housing multiple occupancy. Great location, great investment opportunity for those that are shy to travel further than central London or London. We're guiding this at £700,000, a guide price. I've already had some bids on this one prior to the auction, and of course we will consider bids prior to auction. But if not, it's on the 24th of May. I look forward to hopefully dropping the gavel on that one.
Indeed. And we're going to drop the gavel on today's show, I'm afraid, Joe, because that's all we have time for. So thank you very much indeed, as always, for all your wisdom, Joe. Fascinating conversation, as always. Thank you for watching. Hope you found that of interest. And would you join us again, please, for another Property Matters, this time next week?